The most-watched commencement speech in history began like this.
Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. That's it. No big deal. Just 3 stories.
A few weeks ago, I made an episode with the surprising conclusion that the way a diet and nutrition book is written predicts future sales more reliably than the message or the science behind it. So, a talented writer with no scientific background who tells powerful stories can often have a bigger influence on public opinion than a strong scientist who just tells us the facts.
One thing I learned writing a book about pop culture hits and entertainment is that stories are weapons, for good or ill.
I listed 10 ways storytelling wins the day, with the king of them probably being emotion.
I'm one of those people that makes you cry and laugh, because in the end, people aren't going to remember what you said, people are not going to remember what you did, but they are going to remember how you made them feel.
The trouble is I had more than 10 ways on my mind, but as the episode approached 30 minutes, I was afraid you'd say, "Stop talking, old man. If you need to keep talking, get an Amazon Echo Silver."
Clarissa, how many did old Satchel strike out last night?
Satchel Paige died in 1982.
How many he get?
Satchel Paige is dead.
He what now?
Died.
Who did?
Satchel Paige.
I don't know about that.
Some of these things lean into the dark side, so they're not all available to credible scientists and doctors. But they are very effective at breaking through the noise, so I think we should know how they work so we can understand how they mess with us. The next one starts with a great story, of course. The same year we launched the internet bookstore fatbrain.com from our garage, Jeff Bezos launched Amazon.com from his garage. The problem we both had is we were like the 100th and 101st bookstores online. Bookstacks had already been online for 3 years, and it was a good store. Amazon's answer was to put all million books in print online to offer a selection that no one had ever seen before. They didn't believe in inventory back then, so most books usually shipped in 2 to 3 days, and many took 4 to 6 weeks, or turned out to be unavailable. We had less selection, but we showed stock status and promised same-day shipment if you ordered by midnight. No one had seen that before. We both took off, went public on the NASDAQ, and the other 100 stores mostly faded away. I was writing lists of recommended books, and they were very popular, but the problem was some of our customers knew more about these books than I did. So we let our customers write their own reviews. They could title a review, and they could assign a 1 to 5 star rating, which was my favorite feature, and other people could upvote their reviews. Revolutionary. What happened next terrorized us.
Our home telephone rang, and a man bellowed into the line, "This is the CEO of Simon & Schuster, and I need to talk to Chris immediately." I said, "Chris is in the shower." And he said, "This is urgent. Hand the phone to him in the shower."
"This is the CEO of Simon & Schuster, and if you want to keep your company, you will be in my office in New York tomorrow, or we'll sue you out of existence. Your user review system is outrageous, and people are libeling our authors."
That really rattled me because the last thing we needed was lawsuits from big publishers. Nasty. After I took the red-eye to New York, he seated me on a low couch in his plush office on the Avenue of the Americas in Manhattan. He was in a much higher chair, and when he looked down on me, he really tore into me.
"Slander, libel, outrageous. Shut it down, or we'll see you in court."
And for 6 harrowing months, we lived under threats from the publishers and some outrage from the authors. And then a miracle happened. Amazon copied our user reviews exactly as we had designed them. That outraged our engineers, who thought Amazon engineers were being thieves, but it turned the anger of the publishers towards Amazon. Such drama. And then Jeff Bezos did something that showed his brilliance and left me in awe. He spoke about it at Stanford's Business School, and I attended. He said they did an analysis of Amazon reviews and shared the data with the publishers. It showed that 5-star books sold pretty well. 1-star books didn't sell, but the combination was often the ticket to big sales. Controversy sells, and just like that, the publishers zipped it and stopped complaining. Jeff ended his talk with a line I will never forget. He said this proves yet again that the only real problem in life is to be ignored. Want an example?
Cheers and full-throated huzzahs are in order for Prince Harry, whose memoir just broke the Guinness record for fastest-selling nonfiction book of all time.
But here are the Amazon ratings for the new world record nonfiction book. Tons of controversy. But how do you drum up controversy?
It's all about conflict, the thing that we instinctively try to avoid at all costs in the real world, but we can't get enough of in books.
Whenever your character doesn't have a problem and isn't actively even struggling against or trying to resolve a problem, the audience tends to check out a bit.
But we don't all relate to the same kind of conflict, right? Well, there is a gold standard for conflict, and I'll let the giant of Hollywood storytelling, Robert McKee, explain it.
And so you need characters with tremendous inner conflicts, and there's various kinds of inner conflicts, but the most compelling are moral conflicts, of course.
Here's a great example in nutrition. This is Nina Teicholz explaining the moral conflict Ancel Keys had during the 7-country study.
And he published it in obscure German-only journals. I had to go back to obscure places. He really didn't want this data to get out.
Now that is a moral conflict all of us can relate to. A prominent scientist burying the data to mislead us? That could ignite serious viral rage on the internet. I asked nutrition professor Marion Nessel what she thought of Ancel Keys. Another nutrition channel picked up on it, and here's their rebuttal.
I once asked the question, why wasn't he Nobel Prize winning?
Because he was a criminal and ought to have been locked up in prison.
To me, Ancel Keys is a great hero.
Well, you should also go to prison then, Marion.
Who knew you should be imprisoned for popularizing the Mediterranean diet? And that Marion Nessel should be imprisoned for expressing support of Ancel Keys. The problem is Nina made that statement up about Ancel Keys burying his data. What other scientist has written an entire book published by Harvard University Press and still available about one study? If there was a world record for how many papers were published in mainstream journals about a study, I think Ancel Keys and the international team of scientists who worked on the 7-country study would hold it. They published more papers in mainstream journals than for any other study I've ever heard of. More than 500 papers. Several were in international journals because it was an international study, and the scientists were spread across 7 countries. That's not hiding data, that's getting data to a broader audience. The only thing I couldn't find were papers in German-only journals like Nina claimed. So why isn't Nina's fiction a problem for her? It's because controversy sells. Just look at me raising awareness of her book. The pushback she gets is from scientists, and that's pretty harmless when it comes to public opinion because they don't have the storytelling superpowers that she has to win over consumers. Publishers do have to worry about libel laws, but they don't apply when someone is deceased like Ancel Keys. And who is her publisher? None other than my old friends at Simon & Schuster. I might get a call in the shower about this episode. Maybe I need to call the CEO of Simon & Schuster and demand that he meet me in my YouTube studio tomorrow. Dude, you have a serious moral conflict over not checking Nina's references before you published that book. Outrageous. My chair's pretty tall. Moral conflict really pushes our buttons when we think we're being lied to. Dr. Ken Berry used that to get a bestseller and 2 million subscribers to his YouTube channel. The YouTube channel No Lab Coat Required made a video called You Fell For It, the biggest fib in food history.
The reason we have low-fat anything in the grocery store to this day is because of this 7 countries observational study.
He retold the exact story Nina and Gary Taubes have told so many times about Ancel Keys, and he got 2 million views quickly. But he fell for the fib that Nina and Gary tell that Ancel Keys promoted the low-fat craze.
He knows he doesn't have the evidence, and he immediately starts recommending the country go on a low-fat diet, which is fascinating because there's no concern that you're going to do harm.
You see how powerful Gary made that story by adding moral conflict? Never do Gary, Nina, or the No Lab Coat channel reference the books Ancel wrote before and during the low-fat craze, promoting the Mediterranean diet. Its recipes were full of olive oil, fish, and even some cheese and meat, not low-fat. Okay, you say, No Lab Coat is just a young guy with apparently no nutritional background who's just retelling the story that Gary and Nina tell in his own cool way. Fair enough. So what about one of America's most popular nutrition book authors with at least 14 books, some of them New York Times bestsellers endorsed by Dr. Oz? He's a doctor at the Cleveland Clinic. Surely he wouldn't fall for emotional stories that don't check out, right? Right? One of the cornerstones of Nina and Gary's story is Ancel Keys' cherry-picked countries that fit his hypothesis. They reference this graph that he presented at a hospital in 1953. Here's Mark Hyman buying that story.
Keys was determined to prove himself right he followed up with his famous 7-country study where he traveled to the countries cherry-picked from his graph.
He repeated the same mistake. I mean, he cherry-picked his countries. He chose 6 countries for that perfect correlation. And at the time, there was data available for 22 countries.
All it would take is a quick click to the 7 countries website to see he didn't go to Canada, Australia, England, or Wales. What they were complaining about is 4 years after Ancel published his 1953 chart, 2 statisticians published data from the UN for 22 countries that looked like this.
And when you put in all of those countries, it just looked like a scatter plot.
The trend line is nowhere near as clear-cut.
There was no clear relationship.
No correlation between fat and heart disease.
Any high school student can see that Nina was making that up. There is more scatter, but an obvious strong correlation. Since the 2 men who published the data were statisticians, they reported correlation coefficients. 0.587 for fat overall, pretty strong. Animal fat had a stronger coefficient, 0.677. And notice vegetable fat had a negative correlation, meaning it was associated with lower heart disease deaths. Had this UN data been able to separate fish animal fat from land animal fat, like the 7-country study was able to do, which came later, the animal fat would have shown an even stronger coefficient. And that's because fish are cold-blooded and will turn into solid bricks, unable to swim in cold water if they had a lot of saturated fat. That's true of water snakes, whose oil is like fish oil. So if Ancel was left with only 3 countries from his 1953 graph, and data was available for 22, how did he pick the other 4? The scatter is scientifically interesting. Why is Finland way over there? Why is the Netherlands way over here? One country they picked was Finland because they found a cold area on the Russian border that had the highest heart attack rate in the world. 10x the Japanese areas they studied. One was eating meat and dairy and the other fish and veggies. Ancel explained in his book that a difference of that magnitude was crucial for the study design. It is what made the smoking studies that were going on at the same time so definitive, even though critics pushed back on those studies for decades too, claiming you can't learn anything from observational studies. How can you explain all the people who have smoked for 20 years and who feel and look great? They picked the Netherlands, which was far off the line in the other direction. And then they did something extremely important. They picked 2 countries for which they didn't have data, Greece and Yugoslavia. That introduced some blinding into the study. Ancel wrote in his book, the information about the selection of the areas is offered to counter why do scientists write in passive voice? Unfounded suggestions that the cohorts were chosen on the basis of prior knowledge that promised to support a hypothesis of a causal link between diet and incidence of heart disease. Little did Ancel know that after his death, American book authors would make up a story about cherry-picking and Americans would be tricked by the fib. Speaking about making stuff up.
But he did not go to countries like Switzerland, France, Germany, who ate a lot of saturated fats and also had very low rates of heart disease.
The French were eating all kinds of saturated fat, butter, cream, and they weren't gaining weight, which was a paradox at the time, and they weren't getting heart disease. They had like half the rate of heart disease compared to Americans. And everybody said, wow, what a paradox, what a paradox. There was no paradox. The dietary fat simply wasn't causing obesity and didn't cause heart disease.
I wonder if Jason and Nina actually read the 22-country paper they're referring to. Here's France on the graph. They were less than 30% fat intake and clustered among neighboring countries like Germany and Switzerland. Notice that the Netherlands, which Ancel did pick, is scattered further off Ancel's line with higher fat and lower heart disease than France, clustered around countries like Norway. To this day, France has a higher obesity rate than countries like Italy and the Netherlands. And France has initiatives to reduce saturated fat consumption, like from palm oil. That footage made it look like the study areas were metropolitan. Study areas were actually poor and rural, which was critical to the study design. The poor Finnish lumberjacks on the Russian border were not sneaking out to the sushi bar at night, nor the poor fishermen in Japan hitting the steakhouse. Another advantage to these small, rural cohorts of middle-aged men is they were stable so they could be followed for 50 years. And having 16 cohorts across the 7 countries showed how different the dietary pattern is in different areas of the same country, like Eastern and Western Finland.
The first story is about connecting the dots.
I mentioned in my previous episode that during my Steve Jobs years, I worked with him on some of his big presentations. You can check my TEDx talk about his keynote at the Javits Center in New York. We rented Davies Symphony Hall in San Francisco for another and hired Penn and Teller, Masters of Misdirection, something used famously by magicians, but also by storytellers in movies and books. You didn't see the ending of the movie The Sixth Sense coming, did you?
I see dead people.
Exxon and the American Cattlemen's Association are also masters of misdirection. Best to hear from Penn on what the term actually means.
Okay. You know, there's a word, misdirection, that's used by lay people a lot. It's a magical term. It's a term of art. And the way lay people use it is wrong, because lay people often use it as a synonym for distraction. Like, hey, look over there, do something sneaky here, and then you look back and the trick's done. That doesn't fool anyone. The way we use the word misdirection is kind of a curating of attention, giving the audience a story that can tell themselves that lets them not really know they were distracted.
Previously in this video, popular nutrition book authors gave us a masterclass on how it's done. Notice they directed all our attention to a 1957 observational study. This from people who are very critical of observational studies.
Anytime you see a nutritional epidemiological study, anything that says, oh, this is linked to that, you know, meat is linked to cancer, or this is associated with that, the likelihood that that will be an accurate statement is 0 to 20% of the time.
And they directed us to not just any observational study, but the weakest one I've ever heard of. How do I know it's so weak? Because its authors said so. It was based on the self-reported quantities of food countries produced in the 50s, adjusted by imports and exports, and therefore available for consumption. There was no human data on weight, smoking, or what they actually ate. In the appendix, the authors said these national average figures conceal vital differences in consumption of different sections of a population within a country, i.e. by regions, income levels, occupations, etc. Such detailed information, they said, is often essential for nutritional purposes, and can be obtained only through specific surveys on representative samples of various sections of the population. And those were exactly the problems the 7-country study was designed to solve a few years later with a well-regarded international team of scientists. They assayed the actual food the men ate, collected human data like weight, smoking status, occupation, blood lipids, and they did it for specific regions of the countries, everything the 1957 paper asked for. But Nina and Gary didn't direct us to any data from that study. Was there something they had an interest in hiding? Let's check. Here is 50 years of data from the 7-country study of heart disease death rates for each cohort versus the saturated fat in the men's diet when the study began, as measured chemically in the lab. Here's Eastern and Western Finland. Here are the 2 Japanese cohorts. You can see that increasing saturated fat content by roughly 5 times increased heart disease deaths roughly 7 times. In consumer terms, fish and veggies are down here while meat and dairy are up there. If your book sales depend on promoting meat as healthy, you'd probably do anything to misdirect attention from this chart. But you say, hold on, Chris, modern nutritional studies haven't been that definitive about saturated fat. How can you be so confident in conclusions this dramatic? The answer is, in the poor cohorts of the 7-country study, the men were eating the only food available to them, and the study was analyzing what they actually ate. How many studies do you know that sustained diets that different for that long and knew so much about the food actually consumed? For example, Tony participates in several Alzheimer's studies.
One study flies me to their clinic every 2 years for 4 intensive days of testing me for everything you can imagine. Ironically, although diet is a #1 factor for Alzheimer's, it's difficult for a study like this to get precise information about participants like me.
But, Chris, you say, if Keys was so smart, why did he promote the Mediterranean diet when clearly the Japanese cohorts performed better than the cohorts in Greece and Italy? He answered that traditional Asian diets were at least as healthy, but he thought a Mediterranean diet was more likely to catch on in America. Somebody asked me to review this book I read from Zhang Ji, a Chinese nutrition professor who worked until he was 110. He was involved in a big study of Chinese centenarians. His bottom line was veggies and fish, with veggies as the center of every meal, including breakfast. It's fascinating to see smart people stumble on other Ancel Keys studies.
Amazing book. I mean, this is super detailed about every little physiologic finding with prolonged starvation. I read this on an airplane. I couldn't put it down. It's just phenomenal.
And wonder how he could be so brilliant on that study despite the awful things being said about him.
So the name Ancel Keys probably brings up some really bad memories.
My guess is Mike got his information about one study from actually reading it, but he was influenced by a master of misdirection on another.
Ancel Keys, from what I garner from reading this book and reading Nina Teicholz's book, Big Fat Surprise, obviously he was probably a little dishonest with his 7-country study. When we think Ancel Keys, it's like talking about the Joker. But a lot of what we know about fasting kind of came from this, so I think we gotta take the good with the bad.
Most nutrition scientists who actually read the 7-country study either call him a genius or the giant of the field. Misdirection is a very powerful thing. The starvation and 7-country studies were just 2 of his many achievements. Here's just one more.
Number 1, what flavors did K-ration come in?
I'm afraid that was before the Metrocal days. It was the flavors of the foods themselves.
This is a good metaphor for this episode after all.
My name is Dr. Ancel Keys.
My
name is Dr. Ancel Keys.
Stories.
My name is Dr. Ancel Keys.
We've heard about him.
So will the real Dr. Ancel Keys please stand up?
By the way, whenever I find a study that fascinates me, I can't resist reaching out to the team who authored it. Henry Blackburn ran the 7-country study longer than Ancel Keys did. He's 97, still publishing, and we filled up each other's inboxes with all the questions I have. To the team, I'm that young kid who keeps amusing them with facial animations.
Wow! I feel good. I knew that I wouldn't.
The team produced this 50-year chart, 43 years after Ancel retired and 14 after he died. I think more scientist and technician hours went into data collection for this chart than any other chart in nutrition history. Gary and Nina love to misdirect attention away from that team. Where's the story in honest, hardworking scientists with no conflict? The next phenomenally successful way to sell nutrition books in America is to tap our primal fear.
It is time to face your fear. This is Heads Up. Here's how it's gonna go down.
Walter Gratzer wrote a good book on the history of nutrition, and the title perfectly explains it. Terrors of the Table. We've always been terrified of the unknown in our food.
As classic horror author H.P. Lovecraft wrote, the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. And writers harness that fear, not by revealing horrors, but by leaving the audience hanging in anticipation of them.
So why is it so effective to not reveal details of the horrors?
The most common mistake that keeps it from really being terrifying is that you don't restrain the violence so that the imagination in the audience is amplified and they sit there staring with their eyes wide open and staring ahead, terrified of what could happen.
And that makes it possible for storytellers to run circles around scientists because storytellers don't have to reveal why you should be terrified. And that makes short-form content like on TikTok perfect for primal fear. Here's an example.
Plants don't have claws or teeth, and they can't run away, but a cow has horns, some of them, and they're not going to easily let you kill them, right? It turns out that the plants contain the chemicals that do more warfare than that cow's gonna give you when you eat it. So ultimately, it's hard to kill a cow, but that's the very best for you. It's easy to kill kale, but it's the worst thing for you. They kill you from the inside out. They contain the chemicals, the lectins, the oxalates, the phytates. Stop eating plants. Start eating meat.
But you can do it with long form too, like Dr. Perlmutter does with Grain Brain. Even people who see that cover in Barnes & Noble and don't read the book get a dose of fear. Whatever a Grain Brain is, I don't want it. That book is widely panned by scientists, but it sold more than 1 million copies. Americans seem especially vulnerable to books like this, so we end up in situations like this.
In the medical conferences, when I give a lecture, I tell them, do this experiment. Go to any bookstore, buy 5 random diet books, any 5 books you want. Read the book completely and make on a piece of paper, write on the paper what you're allowed to eat after reading those 5 books, and then you hold up a white piece of paper. That's all that's left. You can't eat anything. That's not healthy. It's developing a horrible relationship with food, and it's just scaring people into these positions that are just unsustainable and untenable and are not necessary.
So why is it such an effective storytelling technique to just say,
they kill you from the inside out? They contain the chemicals, the lectins, the oxalates, the phytates.
But not provide facts, because facts are not on the side of fear factor diets. When we're in the grips of primal fear, we lose all ability to reason. But if you think about it, how hard are we really finding it to kill cows? If plants are trying to kill what eats them, shouldn't we feed meat to the cows? Shouldn't we get to the primates who have DNA similar to ours and tell them plants are poisonous? Are we actually saying Darwin was right when he observed that plants and animals evolved together for the benefit of each other? What if we were to talk specifics about those scary chemicals? Spinach and almonds are high in oxalates, and oxalates can be part of kidney stones. So if you're a vegan making green smoothies and you overdose on spinach and almond milk, maybe you will get kidney stones. If you're keto and eating a lot of almond flour, maybe you'll get stones too. Could be painful, which brings up one of the most important principles of nutrition. Almost everything has a dose-response relationship. You can overdose on almost anything, so if you're into green smoothies, a variety of greens instead of all spinach is probably a better idea. And using a variety of plant milks if milk is what you add to your smoothie. But doesn't that make you ask, does meat have a dose-response relationship, and is Dr. Kilt encouraging us to overdose on it? Here's the thing, meat has chemicals too, and they make kidney stones seem minor by comparison. For example, red meat has a uniquely high dose of a very absorbable form of iron, and any number of scientists have warned about it.
As I mentioned earlier, it's known that iron increases in the brain with age, and an excess of iron is involved with neuronal damage.
Well, actually, red meat probably is bad. So it might actually be the iron and the heme that's in the red meat.
I have 4 good books about it. Population studies show that heme iron and saturated fat from red meat don't seem to be a factor in health when consumed in small amounts. But it's a huge factor when you get to American levels of consumption, dose response. Unfortunately, judging by best-selling nutrition books in America, Primal Fear is a reliable ticket to the bestseller list. Next thing, I think we all know body image sells books. Not many scientists can use that because they're not generally known for their bodies. Although Simon can, but he never does. I think a body image is part of the promise of the book, which we talked about in the previous episode. My impression is you can get ripped on any diet if you're young and you work out, or if you're older and go the pharmaceutical route.
Okay, so the question I think everyone wants to know is like, are you supplementing with testosterone?
The answer is yes.
The carnivore/low-carb authors tend to use body image, so I expected that to be reflected in the trainers who tend to use body image and whose books were popular enough to make my spreadsheet. So this chart came as a big surprise to me. The Mediterranean diet dominated their recommendations. Looking good is one thing, but being an elite athlete who survives 22 seasons in American football like Tom Brady did is quite another. The chart of athletes who made the spreadsheet looked like this, dominated by vegan and Mediterranean diets. This is what Tom Brady says a healthy meal looks like to him. I'm surprised more athletes didn't make the spreadsheet. Even Novak Djokovic fell short, but my impression is that goes back to the rules of character creation in great stories. The audience has to be able to relate to the characters, and that involves weakness.
What makes an audience care about a character really comes down to only 2 things. The weakness, the fundamental weakness of that character, and the character's goal in the story.
My impression is it's hard for most people to relate to the regimen of superhuman athletes unless those athletes struggled with weakness. For example, David Goggins struggled mightily with weakness, and his books are sensational sellers. Finally, even scientists like Carl Sagan, who was a great storyteller, say scientists have an unfortunate disadvantage. He testified in Congress in 1985 about the greenhouse effect, and we know how that went down.
The best estimates, they certainly have some uncertainty attached to them, are that at the present rate of burning of fossil fuels, that there will be a several centigrade degree temperature increase on the Earth, global average, by the middle to the end of the next century.
The great storytellers that the Koch brothers and Exxon funded made us quickly forget Dr. Sagan's testimony.
The thing about science, it's after the way the universe really is and not what makes us feel good. And a lot of the competing doctrines are after what feels good.
So, a great storyteller with no scientific background can make a cover like this with a golden halo over charred red meat, can revel in the fact that it's controversial and it's a message everyone would love to believe. But a large majority of nutrition scientists believe that to maintain their credibility, they would have to ditch the halo and recommend a small amount of red meat, absolutely wrecking the story. Ancel Keys said that, and we saw what happened to him. So what are my conclusions from these 2 episodes? Number 1, you have to respect the power of story, which enabled Gary and Nina to have so much influence in America and get so many people to adopt their storyline. The irony is they're bitterly critical of the low-fat craze of the 80s, but isn't the high-fat craze of the 2020s the same thing, just different macros? I wonder if storytellers in the 2030s will blame Ancel Keys for the high-fat craze. It's that 7-country study where he claimed people were healthy on the island of Crete eating all that olive oil. He must have fudged that data. Stéphane Gouyennet, a nutrition professor who specializes in obesity, charted America's progress versus books from Atkins, Gary, and Nina. He wasn't implying cause and effect, but it's interesting to see the high-fat craze doesn't seem to have changed the slope of the curve. Number 2, Nina and Gary have been very successful at discrediting nutrition science in America, which speaks to the power of story. But if you can see through the emotional stories, it becomes very clear the science is on the side of plant-dominant diets. All the longest-lived, healthiest populations now and for the past millennia have eaten plant-dominant diets. Even the few scientists who still support high animal food diets say antibiotic resistance, pandemics, deforestation of the Amazon, global warming, water use, land use, and treatment of animals are very big problems for high animal food diets. And finally, number 3, the good news is we are seeing some great storytellers who are science-friendly and not corrupted by industry make some very powerful statements about food systems, and that makes me so happy.
The planet can't support billions of large meat eaters. If we all had a largely plant-based diet, we would need only half the land we use at the moment.
That my diet is becoming increasingly vegetarian. The next little while, I may be all the way over. Why aren't you now, Bill? It's a great question. I'm working on it. It's a very interesting question, an important one, and literally a huge one.
If history teaches us one lesson about science, it's that science tends to come out on the right side of history, even if the struggle is long, and scientists aren't necessarily the best storytellers.
You know how you tell a great story? Not by just having happy moments the whole movie, or sad during the whole commercial. What makes a great story is when you go from one chemical to the next one, up and down. That's what great speakers do. When Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone 10 years ago, he came out, he said, I have something revolutionary, it's gonna change the world. We're all excited. He says, it's a smartphone. We're like, yay! Then he takes you down and says, smartphones exist and they're stupid. Why are you telling us this? Because then when he goes to the next high point, it's gonna be twice as fun. And he says, but mine is smarter than your computer at home. And then he takes you down and says, but all those smartphones that are out there, they have a stylus pin. They're really hard to use, awkward, ugly. You're like, oh. But then he takes you up. Let me introduce you to multi-touch.